Hey there, writers and muse daters. Annalisa Parent from the Writing Gym. I have been taking this time during our confinement, as some people call it, our isolation, our at-homeness during COVID-19 to do what I can do by sharing with you some of my favorite books that have impacted me over the years. So here I am again to share with you. And so I was listening recently to a podcast called On Being. If you haven't listened to it, it's worth listening to. I enjoyed it quite a bit. And they were interviewing someone who frequently mentioned the French philosopher Montaigne, I think we would say, in America. And what he was talking about on this podcast, and this is unique to English, that we have this distinction between loneliness and solitude built into our language. So not all languages have that. It's the same word for the act of being alone and the act of being lonely. And I think that that's a really important distinction for a lot of us, because if you're isolated, you might be feeling lonely, you might be feeling a little bit lost. And so this is a really important distinction that I just wanted to share with all of you, that just because you're alone, just because you're isolated, just because you're away, doesn't mean that you are lonely, that you are alone in that sense of not having support. We're all here for each other, and videos like this hopefully can help with some of that. So as he mentioned Montaigne, and he's a huge fan of that philosopher, I thought, you know, I've read a book by Montaigne, and so I went and I dug it out. Now, I read it in French. You don't have to be a geek like me and read it in French, but he's got some really important and poignant things to say. And one of the quotes that was mentioned on the podcast was talking about our minds, and how in our society, our minds can also almost like gallop away from us. They're just out of control. And you know, in the hustle and bustle of our busy lives, maybe your brain feels like that. Mine certainly does from time to time. And one of the things that I do recall about Montaigne, who was nobility, French nobility, and was really on a search for what we would call today in a postmodern world self-realization. And so he shares his thoughts. And this particular book in English, it's just called Essays, so you can look it up. I'm sure this is hundreds of years old at this point. It's in the public domain. So if you're feeling like maybe you'd like to get some connection around solitude, it's a little bit ironic, this might be a way for you to read somebody else's thoughts on what it is to be alone, how to deal with solitude, how we can really find ourselves in the quiet, and the kind of questions that we can ask ourselves. So that's my book recommendation for today, French philosopher Montaigne, and his book called Essays in English. Let me know what you're reading now in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And until next time, happy reading.